Well, hello class. Welcome to week number 5 of Art 385, and that means we are now just moving over the halfway mark, heading into the home stretch of the class. So I do hope that you are hanging in there, that you are coping, and perhaps even enjoying some of these films. As I've said before, some of them I haven't seen myself. It's you have this kind of long list of movies that you should see. It's kind of like long list of books that you should read in literature, and every so often you're like, wow, I never saw that one. Pardon. So, for example, this week's film, Andrei Rublev, I have never seen before. It is a classic Russian film. I think I've spent more time studying Sergei Eisenstein, who Daveche mentioned in regards to his montage theory. One of his most well-known films was a 1925 movie called Battleship Potemkin. Some of you might have heard of that. And I actually, in another class that I teach, use that film as an example of Soviet filmmaking, particularly one of the earliest styles of developed montage filmmaking, which then went on to influence cinema as we know it. That style is still very pervasive and heavily used. So in that regard, we almost have a contrast here with Andrei Tarkovsky's film Andrei Rublev. As you read, and a little background history, the movie was made in Russia in 1966. It's interesting that he was able to receive financing for this film, and yet upon its completion and screening, the Soviet censors were like, whoa, 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 we got to cut some stuff out of here. They were constantly debating about what to release and if they should release it. It wasn't until, I think, 1969 that the international world actually got to see it. And someone's delivering something at my front door here. But in 1969, it won an award at the Cannes Film Festival. And from there, it kind of began to grow on the international scene, and people began to enjoy it. And it really wasn't until the fall of communism that all of it was able to be put back together again. And the full, almost 3.5-hour version, which I received from Netflix from the Criterion Collection, I'm assuming most of you will have received the same thing. I have to be honest, it almost has moments like Birth of a Nation. If you have not seen that film, D.W. Griffith's epic, 1915, I believe it was, often referred to as the first feature film. Not necessarily true, but is really the first feature to have massive popularity. And also a massive amount of problems. We don't have time to go into it, but it painted the Ku Klux Klan in a very positive light. But anyways, if you've seen that movie, it is over 3 hours long, and it's silent. So at least with Andrei Rublev's movie here, Andrei Tarkovsky's movie, Andrei Rublev, we've got sound, and as I watched it, I began to get absorbed into the sound. There's really good sound design going on here, along with a very epic sort of picture. But before we get into kind of the art and the visual aspect of the film, I want to set up just a little bit about what the overall book and approach was in this regards. The book as a whole, as we work through it and study, I really believe that the author here, I've told people, I think this is probably her dissertation. Take 8 films, look at them, try to compare them to paintings, and in some ways she really does a great job, and in others, honestly, I think all of us kind of maybe get lost in the forest as she explains the various trees to us. But on the whole, what she's doing is working through various movies, and particularly various directors here who have not just an artistic point of view, but they have an auteur's driving force. And each of these movies were adapted. If not adapted, they emulated. If not emulated, they copied various styles of painting out there, and I think that's, hopefully you've grasped that by now. For example, last week's film was very influenced by pop art, and hopefully you were able to see at least that influence. Now, as I've said before, obviously these movies are not the ones that are right at top of your Netflix instant queue that you want to watch. But it's good, even as, last week, I hope most of you watched Francis Schaeffer's, is just one part of a 10-part documentary that I had you watch. But he often talks about how there's philosophy and people who think about things. And then that slowly works its way down towards the average common man. So you had the philosophers up here, and then they influence perhaps the high art, and then they influence the low art, and then that is consumed by the masses. There's a lot of different layers in between the ivory towers of philosophy down to the common man. But nonetheless, we see how philosophy and art often go hand in hand, and how they influence the way movies are made. For example, the philosophy of existentialism, which we spent a fair amount of time on last week because I didn't want anybody to be lost on that, and how that thinking pattern, how that philosophy influences the way they approached making the movie. And I hope you see a direct correlation there, particularly with a Red Desert, and I'm going to butcher the name here, so I'm not going to say Jean-Luc Godard's movie that we watched last week. But the idea that, Petro, Du, or Lou, anyways, I'm horrible with French. But anyways, you could see the influence of the philosophy, the influence of the art, pop art, on the cinema there. Now, maybe that movie isn't one that we would normally watch. However, those movies, and another class that I teach, I show a direct correlation between the New Wave and then, say, for example, A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, which came out in the early 60s as well. Now, some of you, I would hope that at least half of you have seen that movie. It's an excellent, fun, entertaining movie. And it's a little bit looser. It's a little bit freer from the Hollywood style that we talked about. That studio era where there's seamless editing and there was a strong narrative and it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. A Hard Day's Night, at times, just has various montage scenes with the Beatles music and girls chasing after them, or them on a train, or them trying to get out of a movie theater. So there's sequences that, on a whole, the movie works on a whole. We spend literally A Hard Day's Night with the Beatles. We're on tour with the Beatles. That's the story for you. And we get to see the highs and the lows of having fans chase after them, as well as being adored. It works as a movie. There's a lot in that movie. It's very influenced by kind of this new wave, the French new wave of filmmaking. And then obviously the Beatles, as big and popular as they are, were a vehicle, if you will, to kind of help spread that particular style. And then as the film school generation, as they're often known, the Francis Ford Coppola's, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, a lot of these students who were in film school during the 60s, they were watching these movies come out. They were watching the high art as well as the Hard Day's Night, and they began to make movies that had an influence but weren't directly from those particular movies. So I often end the class where I have the students watch Jaws and try to find correlations with some of these new wave films. And it's not impossible. It actually is, it's a fairly simple project to do. And you might think, I don't understand, but Jaws was nominated for a Best Picture there in 1975-76 when it came out. And the sequels are the ones that are the problem. But the original Jaws is actually a really well-told story and beautifully shot, and nonetheless, we are digressing here. So today, as we begin to look at Andrei Rublev, what we're looking at is another example of a director who is influenced, inspired perhaps, by a form, a genre of art. And today, obviously, if you've read the chapter, it is about iconic art. Icons. Now, a lot of us, I would assume, we're at a Baptist school, which is in the Protestant tradition. I myself am in that same sort of born and raised as a Protestant here. We don't quite get icons. It's different. The Protestant Reformation was very much opposed to icons of the Roman Catholic Church, let alone Eastern Church. And so John Knox is very known in Scotland for going into these cathedrals and taking these statues and paintings and breaking breaking them and burning them because they felt that they were violating, I believe it's the second commandment, thou shalt not make any graven image before me. They saw it as idolatry. And so that still exists within our Protestant tradition. And I probably could, I don't want to offend anybody here in that regard, but I probably could sit down with a cup of coffee and still say, maybe I want to go to the extent of John Knox of burning and destroying these sort of things. But I would say I can understand that sentiment. But over a cup of coffee, we would have a very nice conversation in that regards. If anybody here is from a Roman Catholic or Eastern faith, we could disagree in a very loving way. But I'm assuming that many of us here are from a Protestant sort of background. So when we think of icons, we don't really necessarily connect. It seems different to us. So when we are looking at a film director who is influenced, who desires to even perhaps emulate an iconic sort of filmmaking style, it might be a bit confusing for us. I think Del Vecchie said it best that what Tarkovsky was trying to do was a restorative cinema of iconic painting, or I think she put it as cinema as restorative icon painting. And he was trying to have this connection between Byzantine iconic art and the modern world, if you will, in making this in 1966, and then connecting it back to the Middle Ages here. Just real briefly, in the Eastern tradition, in the Eastern Orthodox faith, they don't view icons as idolatry or as any sort of graven image. I looked some of this up, orthodoxphotos.com. There are a couple other Orthodox websites out there where you can find information in this regards. There's even I think it was Russiapedia, similar to a Wikipedia. I'm always cautious with any sort of pedia because it's user-generated, so I read several sources. But from what I could gather, and what I've studied in the past, that icons, they don't see them as graven images because they see that Jesus came in the image of God. He was, if you will, the human image of God, that God made himself into Jesus. And so, if that was the case, then it's okay for people to paint pictures of Jesus and even of his mother and of other saints and so forth. And they didn't see that these images were being worshipped directly. No. That they were more or less being venerated. Now, as I said, orthodoxphotos.com said, against the charge of idolatry, the Eastern Church made it quite clear that the faithful do not worship the wood and paint, but deeply respect, venerate, the person depicted. The church made a clear distinction between adoration, which is worship only due to God, and veneration, which is a deep respect here. And so the Orthodox makes no such claim concerning icons as idolatry and so forth. So I think that's at least fair enough. Trying not to create any sort of straw man or fake assumption of what they believe, but that these icons were revered, that they were used as perhaps a vehicle, a tool in worship. And Del Vecchie does a good job of explaining this a little bit further about how you are pulled into the picture, how it helps connect us with the spiritual world in that sort of regards. And so I believe Del Vecchie, and if you do any further research on icons, that Tarkovsky was really trying to now, let's make a movie. Now, you can look at the movie and see that it doesn't directly emulate an icon, because we'll talk about the style of icons here in a moment, but the ability for us to be absorbed, to be consumed, to be brought closer, or perhaps closer to God, or to have God draw closer to us as we watch these particular movies. I think it's a side note here, interesting to point out, that this movie was made during the height of communism in the Soviet Union, 1966. It was in the midst of the Cold War, and communism still had a very firm grip over the Soviet Union, particularly even over Russia as part of the Soviet Union there. And so the Soviets were not big fans of religion. Of course, they had their state-run Orthodox Church to appease people. They knew they couldn't completely wipe it out, but a true communist was an atheist at heart. They had no faith in anything but man and a kind of a humanistic, modernistic sort of worldview that they could make the best of it through men working very hard. And so the fact that this movie was made during this time is very interesting. Internet Movie Database says that the Soviet censors actually cut about 20 minutes of this movie when it was first made. And that what they were concerned with. Now there is some brief nudity in this. Let me warn you, particularly during the pagan ritual sequence. It's kind of a, I believe, I could be wrong here, but I believe it's kind of a spring or summer solstice night where they go out into the woods and make love and so forth. And so you see some side shots of naked people walking through the forest. It is not gratuitous in nature. There's even a moment there where Rublev watches what's happening. He's almost astonished. He's almost maybe even pulled in, and you can kind of see this tension as trying to live a Christian life and yet not being pulled into the very fleshly moment here going on there. But I will warn you, there is a little bit of that. It's about an hour into the movie there. But so the Soviets weren't necessarily concerned with the nature of nudity or the nature of violence in it. What they were concerned about is that the movie is profoundly spiritual. And you could even say it's anti-materialistic because these monks are really trying to separate themselves from the world. And its heroes at the core, Andrei Rublev, some of the other monks, the heroes at the core are very suspicious of worldly authority. In fact, we can see men who are plotting to take over other seats and other thrones and so forth. And so it has a very kind of questioning aspect about human authority in that regard. And so it's interesting that when this movie came out in '66, that the Soviets were really concerned about it. I even think to a certain degree, too, that at the core, the Russian Orthodox Church is a very nationalistic church. And I'm sure the communists were concerned that if they connected with their past and perhaps even a past where they were more of a free people, that this might stir up some sort of nationalistic sentimentality against kind of the Soviet Union and communism. But anyways, that aside, let's dive into the movie here for just a brief moment here. Let's see how long we've been going. Excuse me. Okay, we'll try to wrap this up here in just a few minutes. That aside, Dalvece on page 141 says that this is a Via Crucis. It is a series of separate panels. As you watch this movie, I believe it's 7 unique segments that are put together. They don't necessarily work as a narrative, and once again, very similar to movies we've seen in the past here. It's not necessarily a movie that has rising action, a climax, and then a resolution at the end here, a beginning, a middle, and an end. No, it's more or less various, I hesitate to say vignettes, but various series, various panels that are pieced together. And in that regard, that is very iconic. If you go into an Eastern Orthodox church, perhaps you've even been into, a Roman Catholic church. I've had the